At my wedding, my grandmother grabbed my hand and whispered, "Don't marry him, he's family." My blood turned cold as I laughed nervously. That night, I went through my father's old letters and found a secret that changed everything. I had almost married my own half-brother. My blood ran cold. I laughed nervously, brushing it off as the ramblings of an old woman. Maybe she was confused. Maybe she had mistaken my fiancé for someone else. Maybe she had been sipping champagne when she shouldn't have. But the way her fingers clutched mine, the way her wrinkled eyes looked into mine, dead serious, shook me to my core. I pulled my hand away, forcing a smile. "What are you talking about, Grandma?" She just shook her head, eyes darting toward the guests. "Not here," she whispered. Then, with a final squeeze of my hand, she added, "Talk to your father." I turned to look at my dad, standing at the far end of the reception hall, chatting with my fiancé's mother. He looked happy. He looked normal. Like a man who had not just let his only daughter almost marry her own half-brother. Because that's exactly what happened. Hours before the ceremony that morning had been a blur of excitement. My bridesmaids had flitted around me, fixing my veil, zipping up my dress, making sure every strand of hair was perfectly in place. My mother had kissed my forehead and told me how proud she was. My father had teared up when he saw me in my gown. It had been perfect. My fiancé, Daniel, was the love of my life. We had met at work 3 years ago, an instant connection. I was drawn to his kindness, his patience, the way he listened. He had proposed last year on a trip to Maine, down on one knee at the edge of a rocky coastline, waves crashing behind him. Everything had been leading to this moment. And then my grandmother had shattered it all with a single whisper. The reception, a growing dread throughout the ceremony. I tried to shake off her words. But as the night went on, an unease grew in my chest. My grandmother wasn't the type to make things up. She was sharp, clear-headed. She had always been the one in the family to tell the truth, even when it hurt. And she had told me to talk to my father. At some point during dinner, I pulled Dad aside. "Grandma said something weird earlier," I said, keeping my tone light. "She told me Daniel is family?" My dad's smile faltered. It was only for a split second, but I saw it. He recovered quickly, forcing a chuckle. "Your grandmother is getting old," he said, waving it off. She probably got confused. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But something in his voice was off. I watched his expression, searching for cracks. And then, for the first time in my life, I realized something unsettling. My father was lying to me. That night, the letters the moment Daniel and I left the reception, I made up an excuse about needing to check on my parents' house before leaving for our honeymoon. I kissed him goodbye and drove straight to my childhood home, my heart pounding the entire way. My mother was already asleep, but my dad was still awake, sitting in the kitchen with a beer in his hand. "Why did Grandma say that?" I demanded, skipping any pretense. His fingers tensed around the bottle. He exhaled through his nose and shook his head. "She's just being dramatic." "Then why do you look like you've seen a ghost?" Silence. I felt my stomach drop. I pushed past him and went straight to his study. I knew where he kept his old things, letters, documents, pictures from the past. My hands shook as I tore through the drawers, searching for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. Then I found them. A bundle of letters, tied together with a frayed ribbon. Some were yellowed with age, the ink faded. But one, in particular, stood out. It was dated exactly 30 years ago. I recognized my father's handwriting instantly. And when I opened it, my whole world collapsed. The secret my father kept the letter was written to a woman I had never heard of. But as I read, I realized exactly who she was. Daniel's mother. My dad had written to her decades ago. They had been involved. In love. It was clear in the words, the longing in them, the apologies for things left unsaid. But the part that made my heart nearly stop? I still think about the son we had together. I wish I could be a father to him, but I know that's not possible. A son. My father had a son. Daniel. I dropped the letter like it burned me. My pulse pounded in my ears. I couldn't breathe. My father. Daniel's mother. My fiancé was my half-brother. My confrontation with my father, I stormed back into the kitchen, the letter shaking in my hand. "What is this?" My voice was hoarse, raw. My father's face went pale. "Where did you find that?" "It's true, isn't it?" My voice cracked. "Daniel is your son." That means I couldn't even say it. My father buried his face in his hands. I was young. I made mistakes. Mistakes? My throat burned. "You let me fall in love with him. You let me get engaged to my own half-brother." Tears welled in my father's eyes. "I never thought this would happen. I never imagined. Did Mom know?" He hesitated. And that hesitation was enough. She had known. Everything around me blurred. I felt like I was going to be sick. The moment that changed everything. I don't know how long I stood there, shaking, staring at the man I had called my father my entire life. The man who had let me walk straight into disaster. Somewhere in my mind, I heard my grandmother's voice again. Don't marry him, he's family. She had tried to save me. And my own parents? They had let it happen. I wasn't just heartbroken. I wasn't just devastated. I was furious. And I was going to make sure they paid for what they had done. The night my world fell apart, I could barely stand. My legs felt like they weren't mine. My hands were shaking so hard I had to grip the kitchen counter just to steady myself. You knew, I whispered, looking at my father. You knew this whole time. He didn't deny it. My heart pounded. I turned and ran upstairs to my mother's room, my breath coming in short gasps. I didn't even knock, I threw the door open. She jolted awake, blinking in the dim light. Sweetheart? What's wrong? You tell me, I spat, throwing the letter onto the bed. She reached for it, but her hands trembled as she picked it up. I saw the moment it hit her. The blood drained from her face. Where did you get this? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. Doesn't matter, I snapped. Did you know? That Daniel was, my throat tightened. That I was about to marry my brother? Her silence was my answer. I let out a hollow laugh. You sat there and watched me fall in love with him. Let me bring him home. Let me plan a wedding. Tears filled her eyes. I wanted to tell you. I did. But you didn't. She swallowed hard. I thought maybe it wouldn't matter. You two didn't grow up together. You weren't raised as siblings. You thought what? My voice rose. That it wouldn't count? That biology didn't matter? That I wouldn't care if I was sleeping with my own brother? She winced at my words, but I didn't care. I needed answers. The truth I never saw coming was it Dad's idea to keep this a secret? I asked, my voice like ice. She shook her head. No. Something in her face shifted. A flicker of something I couldn't place. I stepped closer. Then whose idea was it? Her gaze darted to the letter, then to the open doorway. My father was standing there silent. His face was unreadable. I suddenly felt like I was missing something bigger than just their lie. Then she whispered. It was her. I frowned. Who? She hesitated. Then, with a trembling breath, she said, Daniel's mother. I froze. What? My mother's voice was barely above a whisper. She knew from the beginning. She knew exactly who you were. And she let it happen. A new betrayal. I shook my head. No, that doesn't make sense. Why would she? Because she wanted revenge, my mother cut in. For what your father did to her. I turned to my dad, my stomach twisting. What is she talking about? He exhaled sharply and sat down, rubbing his face with both hands. I left her, he admitted. When she was pregnant with Daniel, I walked away. I was young, stupid. I wasn't ready. I moved on, met your mother, started a new life. I stared at him. So she what? Found out about me and decided to let us fall in love? As payback? Mom nodded. She's not over what happened. She wanted to ruin your father's life. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Daniel's mother had known this whole time. She had smiled at me, hugged me, called me her future daughter-in-law. And the whole time, she had known exactly who I was. She had let it happen. I thought back to every conversation, every moment we'd shared. Had she ever slipped up? Had she ever hinted at the truth? No. She had been careful. Too careful. And suddenly, I understood. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't fate. This was planned. I had been part of her game. The confrontation. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I got into my car and drove straight to Daniel's mother's house. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. She answered the door with a warm smile. Sweetheart. What a surprise. I wanted to vomit. I pushed past her into the house. She barely reacted, just closed the door behind me. I'm guessing you found out. Her voice was calm. Too calm. You knew, I said, my hands shaking. You knew Daniel was my brother. And you let it happen. She tilted her head slightly, watching me. Then, after a pause, she sighed. I did. I had braced myself for a denial, an excuse. But she didn't even try. I swallowed hard. Why? She walked to the kitchen, poured herself a cup of coffee like we were having a casual morning chat. Your father took everything from me, she said finally. My future, my security, my pride. He walked away like I was nothing. And then he got to live his perfect little life. She turned to face me, her eyes cold. I wanted him to know what it feels like to lose everything. My skin crawled. By using me? I choked out. By letting me fall in love with your brother? She shrugged. I didn't force you. I just let things happen naturally. My vision blurred with tears. I trusted you. I loved Daniel. My voice cracked. And you let me plan a future with him. You watched as I stood there in a wedding dress. She didn't flinch. And it worked, didn't it? I felt like the air had been knocked out of my lungs. She had won. She had destroyed my father's world. And I was just collateral damage. I stared at her, my hands clenched into fists. You're a monster. For the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Not regret. Not guilt. Satisfaction. I turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind me. My world had already been shattered. But now? Now, I was going to make sure she paid for what she had done. A new nightmare unfolds. I drove aimlessly after leaving Daniel's mother's house, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. She had let it happen, watched me fall in love with my own brother, all so she could get revenge on my father. But what now? What was I supposed to do? I pulled over to the side of the road, gasping for air. My wedding was ruined. My relationship was a lie. My entire life felt like a sick joke. And then, my phone rang. Daniel. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting into knots. I hadn't told him yet. He had no idea. A part of me wanted to ignore it. But another part, the part that still loved him, despite everything, needed to hear his voice. I answered. Hey, where are you? I've been calling. You just left last night without saying anything. His voice was soft, concerned. He had no clue. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Daniel, we need to talk. Daniel's reaction: we met at a quiet park, far from the chaos of the wedding venue. My hands trembled as I held the letters out to him. He frowned. What's this? Read it. My voice was hollow. As he read, I watched the color drain from his face. His breath hitched. His hands clenched the pages so tightly they wrinkled. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with horror. No, this can't be real. I wish it wasn't. His whole body was shaking. He dropped the letters like they burned him. He couldn't even say it. I nodded. Half-siblings. His face twisted in pain. My mom knew? I exhaled sharply. She orchestrated the whole thing. A muscle in his jaw twitched. You're saying my own mother set us up, knowing we were related? I nodded. I saw something crack in him. His breath turned uneven, his fists clenched. She's been lying to me my whole life. Neither of us spoke for a long time. We just sat there, letting the weight of it all crush us. And then Daniel did something I didn't expect. He pulled out his phone. Another lie uncovered. He scrolled through his messages and muttered, I need to talk to her. I need answers. I watched as he sent a text to his mother. A simple message. I know everything. Meet me now. Almost immediately, 3 dots appeared. She was typing. Then, the message popped up. I can explain. But not here. Come home. A chill ran down my spine. Something's not right, I whispered. Daniel hesitated. What do you mean? I shook my head. She's too calm. She's not denying it. It's like she expected this. Daniel swallowed. Then let's find out why. A darker truth: we drove to his childhood home in silence. When we arrived, his mother was already waiting for us on the porch. She didn't look surprised. She just sighed and gestured for us to come inside. I stepped in cautiously, my heart pounding. Start talking. She closed the door behind us and folded her arms. I know you hate me. And I don't blame you. But there's more you need to know. Daniel's hands trembled at his sides. More? Her lips pressed into a tight line. Then she exhaled. I lied about something else. About who your father really is. My breath hitched. Daniel's face twisted in confusion. What are you talking about? She hesitated, then finally said, Your father isn't the man who raised you. And he's not her father either. Silence. A cold wave of confusion washed over me. What? She rubbed her forehead. Your father, both of your fathers, were not the same man. I let you believe it because it was convenient. Because I needed your father to suffer. But biologically, she shook her head. You and Daniel aren't related. I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. The ultimate betrayal. I couldn't process it. You mean, we're not siblings? She nodded slowly. Daniel collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. Why the hell would you do this? Her face was unreadable. Because I wanted to destroy your father. And I did. I felt sick. This woman had lied about everything, let us believe we were related just to get revenge. I clenched my fists. You're a monster. She didn't deny it. Daniel stood up suddenly, his expression dark. I don't want to see you again. She opened her mouth to say something, but he was already walking toward the door. I followed, my mind still reeling. We weren't siblings. But the damage had already been done. We could never go back. And now, all that was left was revenge. Daniel and I sat in his car, parked just a few blocks from his mother's house. Neither of us spoke. The weight of everything pressed down on us. We weren't related. That should have been good news. It should have been a relief. But it wasn't. Because the damage had already been done. Because his mother had controlled us like puppets. Because my father had let his past destroy my future. I rubbed my temples, trying to think. What now? Daniel gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. I need to make her pay. I glanced at him. How? His jaw tightened. by making sure everyone knows exactly what she did. A slow, cold realization spread through me. The wedding. He turned to look at me. What? The guests. The venue. The people who were there. They should know the truth. I could see the storm brewing in his eyes. You want to humiliate her? I nodded. She humiliated us. She ruined us. Now we ruin her. The public unraveling it didn't take long to put our plan into motion. The venue had been rented for the entire weekend. Some guests were still in town. Daniel's mother had planned a small post-wedding brunch to celebrate the family coming together. The irony made me sick. We showed up uninvited. When we walked in, the room fell silent. Daniel's mother stood at the front, talking to a group of guests. She froze when she saw us. She quickly recovered, her lips curling into a tight smile. Daniel. Sweetheart. I wasn't expecting. Daniel didn't let her finish. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice loud, clear. Thank you all for coming today. My mother has done so much for this wedding, and I think it's time everyone hears just how much she's done. I watched her mask slip. A flicker of panic crossed her face. Daniel, this isn't the time. It's exactly the time, he cut in. People started whispering. Heads turned. I could feel the anticipation thick in the air. Daniel took a deep breath. For those of you who don't know, I called off the wedding. And here's why. My mother let me and my fiancé believe we were half-siblings for months. She knew the truth. She let us fall in love, get engaged, plan a wedding, all as part of some sick revenge plot against my father. Gasps. Whispers turned into outright murmurs. His mother's face turned ghostly pale. Daniel, he held up a hand. No, you don't get to talk. I stepped forward. My voice was steady, but my hands shook. She manipulated both of us. She watched us suffer. And she didn't care. That's not true, she snapped, her voice high-pitched now, desperate. I was protecting you. Daniel let out a sharp laugh. Protecting us? You watched me propose to my own sister. A murmur rippled through the crowd. People looked at her, disgusted. Some guests shook their heads. Others whispered furiously to each other. You destroyed my life, I said quietly. Her eyes darted between me and Daniel, realizing she was losing control. I did what I had to do. You don't know what he did to me. What he took from me. She was unraveling now. My father stepped forward from the crowd. His face was unreadable, but I saw the pain in his eyes. You wanted to punish me, he said, his voice hollow. So you punished them instead? She flinched. You left me. You left me pregnant and alone. You think I was just going to let you live happily ever after. A bitter silence settled over the room. You're sick, Daniel said, his voice cold. And I never want to see you again. Her eyes darted wildly between us. Daniel, please, but he was already walking out. And I was right behind him. The aftermath, the news spread like wildfire. Family, friends, even acquaintances whispered about what had happened. Daniel's mother became a pariah. No one wanted anything to do with her. She tried to control the narrative, but it was too late. As for my father, he tried to apologize. Tried to explain why he had never told me. But I wasn't ready to forgive him. And Daniel? We tried. For weeks, we tried. We told ourselves we could move past this. But we couldn't. Every time we looked at each other, we saw the pain. The betrayal. The lies. We had loved each other. And his mother had taken that from us. One night, we sat together in the same park where we had first met. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, Daniel sighed. Do you think, in another life, this would have worked? I felt my throat tighten. Yeah, I whispered. I think it would have. He reached out, took my hand, and squeezed it. Then he let go. And that was the last time I ever saw him. The lesson I learned, it took years for me to heal. I went to therapy, cut ties with my father, built a new life. But sometimes, when I lay in bed at night, I still thought about Daniel. About what we could have been. About the love that was stolen from us. I learned that some wounds never fully heal. And some betrayals? They leave scars that never fade.